For Christians, there is no book more important than sacred scripture. But where did it come from? Sure, we can say that all inspiration comes from God and that ultimately God is the spiritual author of every text, but how did we get from that inspiration many years ago to the book of coffee tables and hotel rooms we fondly know as the Bible? This is Catholicism in Focus. Before Gutenberg made it the most published book in the world, and before the Gideons placed them in hotels in 190 countries, there was a time when the Bible had yet to be written and all people had were encounters with God. As obvious as this may seem, it's important to remember that the Bible did not always exist. St. Peter was not reading the Gospels when he encountered Jesus, and Moses could not read about the law and the prophets when he went up to Mount Sinai. All they had were first-hand accounts of the divine. Often, these encounters were not private, but rather the experience of an already worshiping faith community that helped each other interpret, distill, and pass down what they had found, and eventually, sometimes after centuries of oral tradition, writing them down. This is important for two reasons. First, it reminds us that an encounter with God, not Scripture, is always the primary source of a faith community. Written texts from the already established tradition of faith, not the other way around. And second, that almost no text in the Bible is meant to be taken as purely historical accounts of events in the way that we read history today. Many of the writers were not first-hand witnesses of the events and could not verify every detail as we would expect in modern historical studies. Instead, what made something inspired and worthy of being written down was its theological significance. What about this story helps to capture and retell what God has done in our lives? For some books, like the letters of the New Testament, this provides us with the present form of the text. The author wrote something down, and it was passed directly to the reader and eventually to us. For most of the biblical books, however, there is believed to have been editors or redactors who put together the present form from a series of previous texts. One example of this is the documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. Proponents of this theory believe that there are as many as 4 distinct sources to the text, interwoven by editors years after they were written. Even though the specifics of this theory has some flaws, its main principle that there are multiple authors or editors is almost universally accepted. And the same can be seen in other areas of the Bible, notably the Synoptic Gospels. At this point, likely by the middle of the 2nd century, we have the present form of each individual text of the Bible, completely written and edited. What we don't have is a definitive list of what books are included in the Bible. Just as the writings themselves did not descend from the heavens, neither did the table of contents. After all the books were written and edited, there was still a matter of compiling certain books and excluding others. So what did the church do? In order to be inspired and authentic, theologians and church leaders deemed that a book had to have 3 qualities: associated with an apostle, widely used in liturgies and other writings, and consistent with other teachings of the faith. Unfortunately, this did not settle things. Even as late as the 4th century, some canonical books like Hebrews, Jude, 2 Peter, and 3 John were still being contested, and others like the Didache, 1 Clement, the Shepherd of Hermas, and the Acts of Paul and Thecla were still being used in liturgies and held to be authoritative by certain theologians. It is not until 367 with Athanasius' Festal Letter that we find our authentic list of the New Testament, and not until 382 that it is officially affirmed by Pope Damasus at Rome. And that's just the story of the New Testament. The Old Testament is so complicated that it remains unresolved today, with 10 different canons held to be authentic around Chrysostom. Of course, unless you have a copy of the 1600-year-old Codex Sinaiticus, which I don't, and read the Bible in Greek, which I can't. There is still one more step of reaching our present Bibles: translation. For anyone who has studied another language or simply tried to use Google Translate and gotten nothing but gibberish, you know that translation is a difficult and often controversial task. Should it be translated literally or word for word, focusing on the overall meaning? Maintain the original text or update with inclusive language? How should God's proper name be translated? And what do we do with the lack of punctuation, capitalization, and the spaces in the original? It's no wonder then that there are more than 100 different translations and paraphrases in English alone. While not every translation is done with the highest academic rigor or the best hermeneutical lens, there are more than a few excellent versions approved by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops for use by Catholics, and as a general rule, it's good to compare different versions for new insight. So there you have it, from the mind of God to your coffee table in 4 easy and totally efficient steps. Okay, maybe not. But if you ask me, this is what makes the Bible so amazing. Rather than just a book that floated down from heaven, already complete, or dictated word for word to a prophet, the Bible finds its authority in the gathered community of faith and worship that has experienced God. It is our regular encounter with God that inspired us to write it down in our own human words, that guided us to compile it in an authoritative list, and ultimately that informs us to have the authority to interpret it. While the inspiration of the Bible comes from the origin of God, the work itself was entrusted to us. To me, that's pretty amazing. Thanks for watching this episode of Catholicism in Focus, made possible by the extraordinarily generous patrons on Patreon. This week, I want to especially thank Louis Coker for his support. If you would like to support this ministry of evangelization and catechesis, you can click here or check the description for details. And of course, you can always join the mission by subscribing and sharing this video with others.